So what we've decided is we're going to look back at what were the main storylines from the first half of the Big Ten football season. Number one, yes, Michigan, the feelings forever. That feeling of not knowing what it's like to lose. Both the Wolverines and Spartans undefeated still. A combined 13-0 in the Mitten State. They face each other in 2 weeks. The Big Ten East has been fantastic. 4 teams in the top 10 nationally, and 2 of them, Ohio State and Penn State, with 1 loss each so far. Neither an embarrassing L, Oregon and at Iowa, but it leaves little wiggle room for playoff hopes. The Hawkeyes beat Penn State, as well as Indiana, Iowa State, and more. In fact, before a week ago at this time, Iowa was number 2 in the land, where they ran into the fighting Jeff Brahms last week and picked up their first loss. And the award for Transfer of the Year goes to Kenneth Walker. Former Wake Forest running back has been spectacular for Michigan State, leading the country in rushing yards this season. So that's just some of the main headlines from the first part of the season. We wanted Anthony to sort of look big picture in everything that's happened and tell us 3 things he knows and 2 things he thinks right now. So let's start. The first thing you know is about that East Division that I was just talking about.
Well, when you look nationally and just think about what the Big Ten has done so far as a conference, man, there's not a doubt in my mind the East Division in the Big Ten is the deepest division in college football. I don't really think it's even that close. When you think about having 4 teams right now still in the top 10, 5 teams overall in the Big Ten in the top 11, but of course the highest ranked are within the East. And what's so amazing about it is that each of them individually have had their own little emotional travails to get through. Each have had a few injuries and sort of the toughness of the schedule to wrestle their way through as well. And so where you still have all of them with 1 loss or no losses at this point in the schedule, I just think when you think about everything else in college football, the SEC West would probably try to make the case that they're in the discussion.
Right.
Yeah, but this year that's not the case. I mean, obviously Bama is still really good.
But they've got a loss.
They got a loss, and Ole Miss is okay, right. I guess. They're probably pretty good. Texas A&M just narrowly beat Kent State. They did have the Bama upset there, but I don't think it's very close between the Big Ten East and everyone else.
And they've done what you're supposed to do. You beat all the teams in front of you, so the back half when you're playing each other, that's when you're going to have to pick up your losses. So speaking of the East, your number 2 thing that you know is the head coaching job that's happening in East Lansing.
I can't say enough about Mel Tucker and what he's been doing in East Lansing, man. Like this whole aggregation of marginal gains gospel that he's been preaching day in and day out for the Spartans, the players have completely bought in, and every phase of the game is performing at a high level. When you look back to the schedule up to this point, for the Spartans, they've had the offense be as combustible as any in college football. They've had the defense, like last week, win games for them. They've had special teams, of course, when you think of that Nebraska game and beyond, with the return and the kicking game at a really high level.
The third thing you know is also an individual. Last week, Iowa lost to Purdue. That was the big upset. The wide receiving star for Purdue is your third note here.
No more complete wide receiver in the Big Ten, maybe in all of college football, than David Bell. And I think sometimes you look for an entire receiver core to be able to give you the vertical pass and to give you possession, to give you route running acumen, to give you run after catch, to give you the ability to hand them the football. You have all of that wrapped up in David Bell, and we saw all those elements of his game on display in Iowa City last week, and I think that Kirk Ferentz and all Hawkeye fans are hoping this is the last time they will have to see Mr. Bell.
His notes against Iowa, his career, are just astonishing. Every game is an incredible game. So those are 3 things you know. We want to turn now to the things that you think, and one of them is you think that the Iowa offense will be better next time they play. Why is that?
Well, I think there's tangible evidence to support that when you just look at Kirk Ferentz, when you look at how the Iowa Hawkeyes tend to operate as a program, when they get throughout the season, normally they start a little bit slow, and then as Iowa gets through the year, you see them improving. You see them ascending as the season starts to draw near its close. And so I think the bye week comes at an exceptional time for Iowa right now. The defense can get themselves together, make sure they're going to be as ready and as lathered up as possible for the stretch run. The schedule maybe gets a bit easier. Some tough West Division opponents still await them, but I think as much as anything, this offense and the offensive line will be as prepared as they can be to try and ascend, and you know Kirk Ferentz's teams are always best in November.
Well, then maybe their off week came at the right time, right? I mean, it's that middle point of the season. They get a little break. Perhaps they're getting tired. Their 2 lowest scoring games this year have been the last 2 games that they've played. All right, the next thing that you think is the West Division, and you wouldn't have said this a week ago, you think it's going to come down to the very end?
think of all the defenses in the West Division right now and how, teams like not only Iowa, but teams like Purdue, teams like Minnesota, the defenses in this portion of the division are deep, are talented, have been salty the entire season. And right now, Iowa still leads the way record-wise in the West Division because they have their 3-1 record, and a couple of the teams have their 2-1 record. But I think the fact that Iowa's offense has been sort of inconsistent and sometimes just ordinary, that's why I've been fairly confident for a few weeks now that they're going to have tough tests against Minnesota, against Purdue, even Wisconsin, although the Badgers' offense is probably furthest away out of any of them.
What's interesting is the last 5 years, the West has only been won by Northwestern or Wisconsin.
Right.
I bet you also think it'll be somebody else this year.
No doubt.
And
no
not
doubt
one of those two teams. Our first game of the day on Saturday is an afternoon matchup, special time. Top 25 ranked Purdue hosting Wisconsin at 3 Eastern, 2 Central. But we have a specific pregame show for that game at 2:30 Eastern, 1:30 Central, right here. Let's dive into that game a little bit. And I think one of the first things that jumps out when you see this year's matchup of Purdue and Wisconsin is that Boilermaker defense is legit. It is for real. Why are they so good this year?
Because they get in your face and they won't leave it. You try to mush them out and they just mush themselves right back into your face. And that's what makes them so special this year, because they're aggressive, because they get after you, not only up front, but at the second level, on the back end. They invade your personal space for the entire game, and it forces offenses to be uncomfortable. They've got, of course, a ferocious pass rusher coming off the edge in George Karlaftis, but it's not just him. It's Branson Dean. It's in the middle. They got Lawrence Johnson. They have a variety of players who they rotate within the front seven. And they've got speed at linebacker with guys like Jalen Graham as well. And so they force offenses to find something else to do, because Purdue will not leave you alone. They're as feisty as it gets.
There's only 4 teams in the country that give up less points per game than the Boilermaker defense does.
Who would have thought that coming into the season?
Who would have thought
man?
that?
Yeah.
Incredible turnaround for them. And yet offensively, they've been doing pretty good, but really it's a one-sided offense. They don't run the ball all that often. How much a problem is that?
Normally I would mind that. Like, it kind of gets in my craw sometimes when someone doesn't even want to run the football. I believe Purdue wants to. Jeff Brown's been talking for years now about his desire to have a rushing attack. And you've seen guys like King Doru who've been working through injuries and issues off the field, trying to make sure he can stay in the lineup for his teammates. But when it comes down to it, they're ineffective up front in run blocking, but the passing attack is just so good. It's so consistent, so dynamic that they still find a way to move the ball. So I'm comfortable with the Boilermakers just focusing on an accurate quarterback and receivers everywhere that make plays.
Only one game this year have they run for 100 yards or more as a team, and yet they're ranked in the top 25. By the way, our crew on site for tailgates will be there at West Lafayette. Tailgate will be there. Andy Sabo and Brock Vereen chilling with Purdue Pete Saturday morning. It's tailgate, 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 Central Time. All right, let's turn our attention over to the Ohio State Buckeyes. They are taking on Indiana. This was a close game last year. Hoosiers have given them some scares. C.J. Stroud, another guy I mentioned that it's a really impressive, nationally speaking, defense for Purdue. Really impressive offensively. C.J. Stroud's passing yards per game, 4th in the country.
And remember, like, the first few weeks of the season when folks were trying to figure out, like, what's wrong with Ohio State? How come C.J. Stroud isn't playing better? He was already playing well, and then he kind of heard those sort of whispers, and Ryan Day gave him a week off, and he came back and stepped his game up even more. I love what I've seen from C.J. Stroud the last couple of ball games going into their bye, because he looks sharp. He looks decisive. He was very assertive with the way he's throwing the football and throwing with anticipation, not only from in the pocket, but on the move, as we're seeing there as well. It's one thing to have weapons littering the football field, but as a quarterback, to be able to sort of sift through what coverage you're seeing, what the route combinations are available to you, and to be able to throw the ball and throw the darts, the BBs he's delivering all over the field. I think at the end of the season, C.J. Stroud's going to be sitting in New York.
I was just going to say that. It is
Kismet,
right, huh?
Kismet.
There's no clear front runner. Maybe Kenneth Walker at Michigan State, but there's no real clear front runner. He keeps putting up 300-yard games. They can't ignore him.
And these contests that remain in front of the Buckeyes, there's going to be some big stages available to them, to C.J. Stroud specifically, who knows, maybe even Travion Henderson, but Stroud right now with that receiver core and the way he's starting to perform, man, it's going to be a sight to behold.
And of course, their season ends, as always, by taking on the Michigan Wolverines. Who knows how big that matchup will be? As you look at the Michigan schedule right now, they got Northwestern on Saturday. You can see it on Fox, and then boom, that big one next up. The in-state rival could be a top 10 battle between them and the Spartans. But first things first, got to focus on this week's opponent, the Wildcats. You know, it's been a disappointing year for the reigning division champions there in Evanston, and yet, how good did they look in the last game they played?
What I love is that Northwestern found a way to get into attack mode, and that's certainly not what they've been known for throughout the season, but their bye week seemed to come at a really good time. So they found a defense that could take the ball away, that could pressure the opponent, and Ryan Helinski had his best game of the season. And as he did it, he was able to hit receivers in stride. That provides the run after catch, but also when there was the opportunity to try and throw it over the top. You saw him doing that as well. Love the route combinations that they made available to Helinski. Love the decisiveness he threw the football with. And to be able to be as accurate as he was, that's a lot of what set up some of the run after catch opportunities that Northwestern took advantage of. And there were some missed tackles. We haven't seen a lot of missed tackling from Rutgers prior to that this season, but you love the potential that shows for what Northwestern can become.
Best they've looked all year to you?
Without a doubt, man. Hands down. Offensively, defensively. You know, for teams that ascend late in the year, like I talked about with Iowa, Northwestern is one of those that normally does as well.
And maybe because they look so good, that prevents Michigan from overlooking them with that Michigan State game up next.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that, you know, we saw that maybe Iowa, if there was some sort of lull when they faced Purdue with a bye week coming on the back end of that, Michigan has had a couple of weeks to get themselves ready for Northwestern. And what they just saw on the field from the best version of the Wildcats we've seen all season, I would be shocked if the Wolverines are not ready when they face Northwestern.
Interesting to see what Cade McNamara can do. Career-high passing yards the last time he was on the field. Back to football. Here's what the schedule looks like this week for Big Ten football. There will be 4 ranked teams playing. One of them will be here on the Big Ten Network as the Boilermakers host the Badgers in the afternoon. There's also Illinois and Penn State. That is the second game happening early. It's solid guitar.
It was hard not to.
Solid.
It's a good riff.
There's a good riff underneath that graphic. Illinois and Penn State is happening in that early slot. You know, I think if you're a Penn State fan, you're going, we don't know much about Sean Clifford because James Franklin isn't telling anybody anything. But you saw Taquan Roberson not look great in the last game that he played filling in. So how worried are you?
I mean, worried,
you
know, from a Penn State perspective, with good reason. But I do think there are things that you can glean from the performance out there. I mean, you know, it's his first game, first action that he's gotten, and it was in, you know, probably the most difficult circumstances you could put an inexperienced quarterback in against that defense on the road in that stadium. But I did like the aggression that he threw the ball with at times. We saw him willing to take some deep shots down the field, and it's a very quarterback-dependent offense because of the way they've struggled to run the football with the tailback. So the mobility of Taquan Roberson, I think, can be a part of how they operate offensively as well. Now, we'll see. You know, James Franklin saying, you know, Christian VU is getting some reps on the practice field also. Maybe we see a 2-quarterback system, but I think, you know, as much as anything, he's trying to make sure both quarterbacks will be ready to take the field if need be.
Well, it'll be interesting, too, the kind of defense he has to face, because I know there have been a handful of things Illinois has done defensively that you like, but we also mentioned Jake Hansen is out, and he was one of their leaders on that team.
And it's unfortunate, but I do think a couple of things where on the back end, we've seen multiple approaches from Ryan Walters and that Illini secondary, and I believe if they're going to play off coverage to make sure that Penn State's not going to throw the ball over their head, they'll be in good shape with that. But up front, when you get Owen Carney working to the outside half, outside edge of blockers, Seth Coleman, Isaiah Gay, they got guys who can get to the quarterback and harass, I think, as long as the right alignment and approach is taken.
Yeah. I have to admit an error, by the way. I feel terrible.
You?
Well, earlier in the show, I mentioned that Tailgate is on Saturday, and I didn't mention you. I just said Annie and Brock.
Wednesday, October 20th, Mike Hall admitted a mistake. See you Saturday.